is my pleasure to welcome today's first speaker, Mike College, President of Ipsos Canada's Public Affairs Practice. Mike, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ellen, and thanks everyone for joining us today, and for those of you who are going to listen on when the recording later on. As Alan noted, this is the first of our webinars in a series that we're doing on all things ESG related. As Alan said, my name is Mike College. I head up the Public Affairs Group, as well as some others, but I'm joining you today mostly as our Canadian ESG lead for across the country. And I have the pleasure of introducing two of my colleagues to discuss ESG and corporate reputation. So welcome to Sean Simpson and Megan Miller from our Public Affairs and Corporate Rep team. Thank you for agreeing to lead off the series.
Our pleasure.
So well, I suspect you were more voluntold than volunteered, as is usual when it's the first up. But I think it makes good sense to start with the corporate rep space. I saw your presentation, and I won't steal a bunch of the things that you were going to present because that was where I was going to go initially. But because of the focus that you have in corporate rep on the broader list of stakeholders, citizens, consumers, employees, investors, regulators, and because of the senior executive focus, I know you've been involved in tracking in some way, shape, or form ESG before it was ESG. So about 10 years ago, of course, Sean, as you and I know then, Megan, it was more around corporate purpose at that point, and then it morphed into corporate social responsibility. And now very squarely, we have a much more formal look at the E for environment, S for society, G for governance, and it's continuing to evolve. It is more measurable. It is more likely to be woven through an organization's DNA and their operations, not just a communications exercise, which it very much was 10 years ago. It was about sort of how do we get credit for some of the things we're doing, and if we're not doing things, how do we mitigate them, sort of thing. But maybe more importantly, because of that, increasingly companies, as we know, are being asked to report on both their commitments and their progress on the ES and the G. And so increasingly they're going to be held accountable to, in everything from investors to their consumers to the communities they work in for their actions, or in some cases their non-actions. So like I said, I won't steal your thunder. I know that you've started about 3 years ago in the corporate rep syndicated work you do, Sean, tracking over 100 companies operating in Canada against their ESG performance and helping diagnose how to improve those and tying it to rep. And I know that you're going to weave in, I hope, some of our global work that we've done on ESG on the reputation space. So before you get started, I just want to remind everybody this is the first in a series. There'll be another one coming up July 19th with Ted Doring, who's head of our Creative Excellence group, who's going to talk about sustainability in advertising. And for anyone listening, if you're interested in more than the Canadian perspective, we do a ton of global work on ESG, and the easiest way to get there is to go to your web browser, and you can find links to our global webinar and our newsletter, but go to your web browser and type in Ipsos People Planets Prosperity. So it's Ipsos People Planets Prosperity, and that'll should take you to, if the optimization is right, the webinar, the newsletter, all of those things. So without further ado, thank you, Sean and Megan, for indulging me and letting me steal a couple minutes of your webinar. And I'm looking forward to hearing what you guys have to present. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for the invitation to lead off the ESG webinar series, Mike. Really appreciate it. And what better place to start, I think, than corporate reputation. I'm very, very pleased to share the floor, the platform with my colleague, Megan Miller. Megan and I have been working together on corporate reputation and ESG for a number of years now. And dare I say, I think we make a pretty good team. So we'll tag team the presentation today, looking at some global trends, leveraging some C-suite data we have, but also leveraging the voice of the consumer. So Megan, thanks so much for agreeing to do this with me today.
Thank you so much. Super excited to be here.
So the big question, of course, is what is ESG? Every client, every organization we speak to is in a different part of their journey in their understanding of what ESG is. As Mike alluded to, we used to call it CSR because we don't have enough acronyms in our lives, corporate social responsibility. And where corporate social responsibility was more internally driven or purpose, or the CEO said, well, I think we should do this, or we think that we should support this organization because we're interested in it, it's the right thing to do. ESG, I think, is flipping it around and is more externally driven. Expectations that stakeholders, including consumers, governments, investors, media, any stakeholder you can think of, really, those expectations that they have of the organization. So is ESG, ethics? Is ESG commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion? Is it going green? Is it data security? Is it net zero? Yes, it's all of those things. And ultimately, at the end of the day, ESG is an organizing principle so that we can examine and measure these things in a systematic way. And why is it important to do it in a systematic way? So that we can compare across organizations and across time. That, I think, is also a fundamental difference of corporate social responsibility and ESG. CSR may be more qualitative in nature. ESG definitely more quantitative in nature, so that we can measure, track, and improve performance on all of these things over time. ESG is also, I think, a principle that is less familiar to consumers. But I think what they know in their minds is that, does this company exist to do good, to make life and our society and our planet better? And one of the things that we've promised to cover in today's webinar is how to leverage ESG for the purpose of corporate reputation. And so one of the things that we like to do is a driver analysis to understand if we use trust as our key outcome variable, or if you're a researcher, dependent variable, and look at all of the things that an organization does and how it impacts trust. In this particular example, which is a real life example, we've just debranded, of course, the client for confidentiality purposes. The number one driver of trust for this company is ESG. Not only is it the number one driver, but it is quite far ahead of any of the other potential things that could be drivers, including customer service, including value for money, including quality of products. So this shows the definite link between ESG and corporate reputation and trust. Is it always that ESG metric that comes up as the key variable? Not necessarily. Sometimes it's cares about the well-being of consumers. Sometimes it's ethical business practices. But in virtually every case that Megan and I have studied, there is either ESG or some very close proxy for it. And if we look at how everything is connected in a particular driver analysis for this, again, example company, we see that absolutely everything else that this company says and does flows through ESG, meaning that they can have terrific products, terrific service, they can be innovative, they can be have appeal as an employer, they can help people save money, and they simply will not get credit for it unless they have a good, authentic, credible, and relevant story to tell about ESG. Meaning that ESG can single-handedly undermine all of the other terrific things that a company does. Every year, Ipsos surveys 100 or 150 global C-suites. These are heads of public affairs and communication around the world. And we asked them whether they believe that corporations are filling the hole that governments are leaving. Increasingly, governments are either unwilling or unable to tackle and solve many of the challenges that the world is facing. And indeed, here we find a majority of these C-suite leaders around the world believe that corporations are taking over from government in driving positive change. And that's great. It means that they identify that there's an opportunity to do better in the world and to help consumers, help the planet, and they're taking that opportunity. We also know that senior leaders say that ESG is fundamentally changing the way their business operates. Now, it's 55% agree. Does that mean that 45% disagree? Not necessarily, actually. I think what they're saying is that they've already been doing it. Even before it might have been labeled ESG, they've been working the principles of ESG into their core mandate, the core way that they operate. And we also know that C-suite leaders believe that poor ESG performance has a material consequence on our business. So not only is it, it can be an opportunity, but it can also be a risk. And if we execute on a solid and a clear and impactful ESG strategy, we will help our business. If we don't, it will hurt our business. And so what are those potential risks for not having an ESG plan that is authentic, that is credible, that is effective, that is relevant? Well, one is, as we've shown here through those driver models, that it will have a negative impact on reputation. Poor ESG scores mean poor trust and reputation. Higher ESG scores equal higher trust and reputation. And by the way, that is not a correlation, it is causality. This model shows causality. Ultimately, if your reputation is weak, then you will lose clients. And Megan will talk a little bit more about the consumer perspective in a bit. There can be increased regulation and greater headwinds. And so there is a lot of risk here, and even investors who are now increasingly looking at parking their money, institutional money, with companies who perform well on ESG.
So taking it over to the consumer perspective, we know that looking at the consumer data, there is an imperative around ESG, with 7 in 10 saying it's important to them that the companies they support take meaningful action to improve their ESG performance. And a further 8 in 10 say that performance on ESG issues is important to them when making their judgment about a company, and that rises to 1/3 saying that is extremely important to them. We know that they'll also change their behavior and take negative action based on poor ESG performance, with almost 2/3 saying they'll stop supporting a company if they find out they perform poorly on ESG issues. Now, this is all well and good, but do they actually mean what they say? Do they walk the walk, not just talk the talk? Well, the data shows that yes, they do, and in fact, they already have, with over half saying that they have changed a purchase behavior or participated in a boycott of a product or company because of social, environmental, or ethical concerns. Consumers are really leading with their wallets, and as ESG continues to become increasingly important, it's likely that this will be a key path by which consumers have their opinions heard. What's also important to note is that this figure rises to almost 7 in 10 among Gen Z and 2/3 among millennials, for whom these issues are top of mind, and who are entering into their prime earning years with different expectations of companies than previous generations. So the cost of not acting quickly and sufficiently is increased regulation on your activity in the ESG space. So when we look at consumer sentiment on the amount of regulation on each of the 3 ESG pillars, just under half say there is too little regulation when it comes to protecting the environment, when it comes to kind of what companies should be doing. But we can also see that around 1/3 also say there's too little regulation on improving society and practicing good corporate governance as well. So if consumers don't think you're doing enough, they'll go to their governments to implement the change they're looking for. Now, regulating businesses on E and S is considered kind of low-hanging fruit for governments, so it's important to consider your strategy before the strategy, or potentially lack thereof, becomes a bit of an operational hazard. So you really need to think about how you're going to act before governments essentially tell you how to act. So we have large-scale, global-level data looking at levels of trust in companies worldwide that allows us to see trends in a very big way. And we can see that even though there may have been some strides during the pandemic reputationally across certain companies or sectors, these have not necessarily been maintained. And in Canada specifically, we've actually seen reputations gaining significant momentum over the course of the pandemic by virtue of the way that companies may have taken care of their employees or Canadians during this time. However, we've really seen them flatten out more recently, or otherwise take a hit due to increased economic concern right now. So what's missing? The key opportunity, the answer here is ESG. ESG performance can either enable or block reputational advancement, and ESG really presents the opportunity that's simply not being leveraged. This isn't even necessarily because companies aren't acting in the space in a meaningful way, but they may not be doing it correctly or authentically, or they may not be communicating it effectively or well enough to really unlock the value it adds to their reputation. Now with this, you can't just go out and shoot from the hip. This really does have to be planned out. So that being said, what data do we have to kind of provide a clear path forward for what should be done on each of the three pillars? So starting with environment, comparing global level data and data in Canada, when considering the role of companies and corporate responsibility, Canadians over-index on prioritizing the environment. It's important to note that the data that we're showing here does show some variance by sector in terms of where Canadians see companies having the most impact on ESG. What we're showing here is really an aggregate of all the sectors that we collect data on, but for most sectors, E often comes up as the driver of perceptions of ESG, even for those where E isn't really a clear area of business, such as banking or tech. So knowing that, we ask consumers what priorities they see for protecting the environment when it comes to what companies should address. And this provides some clear direction as to where to start. So far and away, reducing waste and pollution comes out on top. And among Canadians, things like, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, developing products that respect the environment, and reducing the use of plastic. Now, you cannot get away with greenwashing. So if you lack authenticity, credibility, and effectiveness or relevance on this, you will be penalized and your ESG efforts become really an inhibitor rather than an enabler of reputation. So for example, there have been many companies in recent years that have been called out for greenwashing. Keurig actually being one, when making false or misleading claims about the recyclability of their coffee pods, and subsequently having to pay millions in fines as a result. Measure that against the company Patagonia, known for recently allotting all of its profits toward environmental initiatives. So there really are serious consequences towards this. So when it comes to priorities within the social space, in Canada, the top three measures are all about employees and about DEI. So you'll have no real credibility on S if you don't have your own house in order first. So this means that treating employees well and fostering an inclusive environment with DEI in mind are critical. So doing well on these aspects will give you license to engage on S in the community more broadly. But if you don't really, think about your workforce first, your ESG efforts will fall flat. So on diversity, equity, and inclusion in particular, the message is clear. There is a priority. And again, this is significantly higher among Gen Z and millennials. So, recent public response in support of transgender star Dylan Mulvaney and her partnership with Bud Light, for example, and Bud Light's subsequent monetary donation to foundations that support LGBTQ businesses is just kind of one example of this in action in recent news. Working to further your DEI efforts can also help attract and retain top talent, with 3/4 of Canadians saying they're more likely to want to work for a company that has a diverse leadership team. In addition, national immigration targets are around 500,000 per year. So significant growth in the Canadian workforce will be coming from abroad, and you need to ensure that your workforce is an inclusive and welcoming one in order to attract and retain top talent from other parts of the world. And, DEI is important for consumers, and they're really watching and assessing, DEI efforts. They'll make purchase decisions based on whether they see themselves reflected in communications and marketing, and whether they see the true diversity of Canada reflected authentically and non-stereotypically. Now, there are growing expectations for companies to put real weight behind their efforts on DEI, but it can be risky. Canadians are very skeptical that corporate actions on DEI are altruistic and authentic. So that's why it's key to establish credibility within your workforce first. So they'll go on and act as your advocates, and then you can move toward partnering with third-party organizations to lend legitimacy to your actions. Now, actions on governance are more table stakes. They may not be offering a ton of reputational reward necessarily, but there is significant risk if this isn't done right. Canadians really prioritize companies paying their fair share of taxes when it comes to good governance. We have many multi-level organizations in Canada, But Canadians are suspicious. They want to ensure that these companies make a broader contribution to society, of which paying taxes is, a part of that. And what we've noticed is that many of the aspects of G and S tend to be very similar. We split them out for our purposes, but in the minds of Canadians, they're very similar. They're all about the impact on people. So simply put, among consumers, performance that does not deliver on ESG requirements is not going to be tolerated. So thinking about that and moving kind of into what the next steps might be for companies wanting to improve their work or speak more effectively about the work they're doing, we can offer some insights from our, data on hundreds of companies, 100, plus companies within Canada and their reputation. And Sean can share that data now.
So if you're sitting at home, perhaps, or in your office as a communications person, as a researcher supporting communications, and you're saying, well, where do I start with this? I think there are some fundamental questions that you need to ask yourself. The first is, do you know how your company performs on ESG, according to Canadians? What are you known for better or for worse? Companies spend a lot of time trying to gain a hold of their narrative, but sometimes they lose a hold of it as well. And Canadians know a company for something that they don't want to be known for. So what are you known for? What aren't you known for? Where are your opportunities? Where are your risks? Where do you have the credibility or license to play? Where should you be playing? What would enhance our reputation? How do we improve? What drives those perceptions? And ultimately, how can we improve those perceptions? As Megan alluded to, we have answers to many of these questions through our corporate reputation syndicated study, about 118 companies measured in that study. And ultimately, what we leverage that study for is to help clients understand where they are against the competitive landscape and how they can improve perceptions against that competitive landscape. And so we're going to leverage some of those data here for the next couple of slides to talk about ESG and how corporate Canada performs on ESG. What you see here is an aggregate of companies rolled up into industries, and we're able to compare those industries on our ESG index on the very high part, which is essentially Canadians being very impressed with how well these industries are doing, and the vertical line across, or the horizontal line rather, is the average industry in Canada. If you're above the line, you're above average. If you're below the line, then you're below average. And we can see very clearly here that one industry stands out as being a very strong leader in ESG, and that is quick service. So think companies like Tim Hortons, like McDonald's. They do very well, particularly on the social metric. And when you think about a company like Tim Hortons, I mean, they leverage their scale, but also the core of what they do in order to help society. I'll give you an example, the cookies, right? They sell cookies every day, but for one day, they sell cookies specifically for the purpose of raising money to send kids to camp. It's an incredible initiative, and one that is, they don't have to do a lot of different things. It's something they do every day. They just decide to, for a day, to mobilize that for the better good. Banking does quite well, and this is fascinating because a lot of people are skeptical of banks. Sure, they make a lot of money. Are their motivations altruistic? And in fact, Canadians are quite impressed by the way that banks have risen to the challenge to authentically and credibly engage in improving on their ESG performance. We've got TD there listed as an example, but RBC is sort of right tied with TD in terms of leading perceptions. And then we've got companies like Google that stand out from the crowd because they're seen to be just a well-run company, a well-managed company. And even though you don't necessarily see them active in the social space, within communities in Canada, they actually do very, very well on governance. They make a lot of money. Companies or Canadians think that they're an ethical company and that they can be trusted, and they're obviously quite critical to the lives of Canadians. And then you see another company down there. You may not even have heard of them, but for Canadians who have MEG Energy, they're very impressed on their environmental performance. That may seem counterintuitive for a lot of the people online. How can an oil and gas company, energy company, be praised for their environmental efforts? go to their website. Have a look at their website. Everything on there on the landing page is about the energy transition and how they are leading on the issue of the environment and leading that transition. And again, not everybody may know about those efforts, but the ones that do are impressed. We do see some sectors lagging here: electronics, courier, so thinking, Amazon, UPS, for example, airlines, manufacturing always has had headwinds, and there we see the sharing economy at the bottom of the heap. So not only is there variation among sectors, but there's variation within sectors as well. So if we take that quick service, remember, they were at the top of the list, best performing on ESG, we can see here, and this is real data. Again, we've just backed out the brands because we don't want to embarrass anybody here. And you can see there's a huge difference between ESG perceptions of the top company, we've already said who that is, and one of the bottom companies. I'm not going to say who that is, but company 5 clearly is not in the same league with regards to their ESG strategy as company 1 and company 2 are. And this is not just for quick serve, but if we also look at oil and gas, there is a very significant differentiation and variation among all of the companies within the oil and gas sector that we test within our study. Some are leaders, some are laggers. And what's really interesting, this is sort of a fun factoid, is the leaders within the oil and gas sector outperform the laggers in quick service restaurants, the leading sector. So don't feel that, because I'm in manufacturing or because I'm an airline or because I'm an oil and gas company, my perceptions of my ESG are going to be unduly informed by perceptions of the sector. That is untrue. We see here clearly, and in virtually every sector that we study, big significant differences between the best performing companies and the worst. Where are you on this list? You'll want to know if you're perceived to be a leader and a lagger. So if we look at some of the constituent components of the ESG index, again, we have 10 inputs, and we have 2 that roll up into the E metric environments. That's environmental responsibility and operate sustainably. And again, we see a lot of variation across 118 companies on Canadians' assessments of how well they perform. On environmental responsibility, the difference between the worst and the best is 30 points. On sustainability, it's 32 points. Canadian Tire does very well on environmental responsibility. They spend a lot of time on their supply chain and ensuring that they're sourcing materials in a responsible and ethical way. Quaker, actually one of the most trusted brands in Canada, gets very good marks for their sustainability initiatives. The worst company in Canada does not. If we look at social, you'll see that the top performers are even higher on this. PC acts in a socially responsible way. McDonald's has a strong commitment to DEI led by their workforce, and they've earned credibility on that because they have a diverse workforce. And it's also a young, dynamic workforce as well. They spend a lot of time giving jobs to younger people from diverse communities. And then you've got Tim Hortons, and we tried not to use the same company twice, but Tim Hortons just crushes the competition on many of these society metrics, support of charitable and community causes and community involvement. So congratulations to Tim Hortons. And this is one of the reasons why they are one of the most trusted companies in Canada. You can see some pretty poor scores from companies who aren't engaged in charitable community causes. And then rounding out the ESG pillars, of course, we have governance, our 4 metrics there. You can see from financial performance to ethics to quality of management to data security. And I would say on governance, we have, on social, we had from top to bottom 50-point ranges. On governance, we're in about the 40-point ranges. So Canadians do differentiate on each one of these aspects and are more than happy to name winners and consequently losers. So we can help you ace your ESG strategy. You've been hearing us talk about authenticity a lot throughout the presentation. So what do we mean by authenticity? Well, it means that you are using your business know-how to drive change, that the actions that you're taking on ESG are directly related to what you know and part of your process and your ethos, meaning that it's not fabricated as a tangential strategy, but it's part of your core strategy, your core fiber, your core being, and it focuses on creating value, and it's in line with your company mission and brand. I think a lot of organizations that are accused of greenwashing or take missteps on DEI, for example, lack this authenticity because it seems so far-fetched. It seems so far removed from what they do that it lacks authenticity. It's so opaque that they're trying to look at us do this, but it doesn't resonate true. So that's the A. What's the C? The C is credibility. And sometimes we lack credibility on the things, on the areas that we want to be involved in. For example, on the environment. And I think that's one of the reasons why in Canada, you saw those top scores on environment were less than they were for social and governance, because it's not always clear what the link is between a bank and the environment, or Tim Hortons and the environment, or an insurance company and the environment, for example. It's a little bit easier for manufacturing for oil and gas. And so when you're taking actions on environment, for example, you need those actions to be viewed with as credible. And if we lack that credibility internally, what we need to do is go out and find it and create it, meaning that you need to align your ESG actions with what's important to people. We do What Worries the World and Issue Watch to understand what's important to consumers, and then ultimately to leverage relationships with those who do have credibility to bring that credibility to your actions. And the final pillar of ACE is effectiveness. Sometimes I like to call this relevance as well. It needs to make sense, it needs to fit in, and you need to have an impact. And that impact is creating social change by improving the world in some way, because we're fostering inclusion, or we're helping those less fortunate, or we are improving the environment or going net zero. It needs to have some material impact which drives sustainability and ultimately can generate and create goodwill with your stakeholders, whether it's consumers, and Megan talked about the advantage of that, or stakeholders like government. You do not want to be regulated, because that means that your ESG actions will not be of your own making, they will be imposed on you. Or investors. Clearly, people are increasingly parking their money with companies who are seen to do very well on ESG. And so we'll leave it there, but we've got a few minutes to answer some questions that you have been posing along the way. And so if you just give me 1 second, I'll pull up some of those questions. I see them here now, and there's a couple. So let's tackle them one at a time. So for the first question, it says here, you mentioned that corporate Canada does less well on environment overall. It's true. Is there an example of a company that does well on ESG and that stands out? Megan, do you want to take that one?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a great example within Canada, A&W actually. If you think about the ways that they approach their communications and, what they build into the core fabric of who they are and what they do, they talk a lot about their supply chains, that it's Canadian, that it's ethical, sustainable, transparent, and high quality. And they make this story a really key part of their brand identity through their very memorable ad campaigns. We ask questions in our, reputation research about ad recall, and A&W always comes out on top for the ads that kind of speak volumes about their activities within E. So I definitely say that's a great example.
Well, and that what's interesting about that example is that you wouldn't think of quick service restaurants, with their packaging, clamshells and paper things and straws and cups as being a leader in environment, but they've really managed to grab a hold of their narrative on the environment to tell a great story about their supply chain, which also, imparts quality and confidence and trust and jobs in Canada and all of these other things, that can impact perceptions, and they've owned it as part of their core being. So that's a great example, Megan. All right, another question here. If governance is table stakes, is it possible to differentiate on governance? Oh, that's a great question. Often we hear, should we focus on governance? Should we tell our stories about governance? And so there's two things. If you don't mind me answering that one, Mike, maybe you've got something to say as well. But if we go back to those inputs to the ESG index and those four inputs on governance, we saw that there was about a 40-point range between the highest scores and the lowest scores. So are Canadians differentiating on acts of governance? I think the answer is a resounding yes. In fact, even more so than they were on environment, not quite as much on social, but definitely they're assessing Canadians as companies differently. What I would say, though, is that I can see why someone might say it's a little bit harder to differentiate on governance for good reasons. Meaning, you saw there that we had data security, obviously very, very important for banks. Are you going to get a lot more credibility, on data security and privacy by talking more about it? I don't know. But where the greater differentiation is going to happen is in bad performance, right? You can obviously understand what the implications are of a data breach for an insurance company or a bank or a telecom company, for example. So I think that's where you're going to see more differentiation is on the bottom end, or even on poor management. Handling a crisis poorly. That can really hurt a company over time. And so governance, I think, is more than an opportunity. It's definitely a risk, but Canadians will differentiate based on whether you're not fulfilling their expectations when it comes to governance.
I think governance, Sean, is a little bit also like we were with environmental issues 10, 15 years ago, to your point. There wasn't an expectation that corporations weigh in and do better on climate change. It was just don't do worse. Don't get caught dumping oil behind your paddock. Don't have spills. And that has morphed. And what you've seen is now, not only do I want you not to do bad things, but I actually want you to contribute to solutions. And then governance isn't quite there yet. So I think from the governance side, to your point, we're not looking for you to raise everybody's ethical bars. We're just looking after you look after your own right now. So I think it'll evolve as we go forward.
Great point. Let's see. Oh, there's another question here. Why does sharing economy perform so poorly on the ESG index? That's a good question. So sharing economy, think of, again, I don't want to name specific companies, but companies like Airbnb or Lyft or Uber. So Mike, you're giggling. Do you want to tackle that one?
Sure. Since you've said companies' names and they'll have me to find them. Sure. I think there's a couple things on the S, so on the society side. As you noted, they're relatively new, the sharing economy, so they don't have that history of community involvement, of supporting charities, and they're doing it, but they don't necessarily have this is our 20th year of sponsoring the Run for X or doing this with this community group. So without that history, they're not as in the news. They're not as great awareness. So it's, normal that to be down a little bit. And then back to your conversation about governance. On the governance side, I think these companies had great intentions, but sometimes those intentions didn't work out until you've seen stricter regulations, whether that's on the unintended consequences of housing in communities, residential communities being used for the purposes they weren't supposed to be, for parties and those kind of things that people have been annoyed with, or you look at some of the issues they've had with contractors versus employees and some of those conversations that have gone on about where do people fit, and some unions pushing back on. So there's been some controversy around them, whether it's for their own fault or not, that has created that, and it sort of stuck to them a little bit.
Terrific. I'm not seeing any more questions here. So I think without further ado, then we'll send it back to Ellen to wrap up the webinar.
Thank you guys very much.
Well, I just really want to thank Megan, Sean, and Mike for today's really interesting and timely presentation. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Be on the lookout for a link to today's recorded presentation. We expect that to come in the next couple of days. And that will also include a link to our next webinar in this series on July 19. In fact, if you give me a moment, I am going to put into the chat box for everyone to see a hyperlink where you can access the series directly as well. So that now concludes today's webinar. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Alan.
Here.